To call Dragon Quest the granddaddy of JRPGs would not be an overestimation of the franchise's achievements. What we now see as staples and tropes of the genre were, more than 3 decades ago, revolutionary ideas that were originally implemented in the very first Dragon Quest title, which laid down the blueprint that games of its ilk follow even to this day. But while the series' legacy is unquestionably massive, and its consistency over a period of many years plain for all to see, the question that faces Dragon Quest XI, the latest and long-awaited installment of this venerated franchise, is what makes it special. Sure enough, Dragon Quest XI's tendency to play things by the book a bit too much will be one of the criticisms that'll be leveled at it the most often. But a lack of originality, I think, is something that stings the most when the game uses it as a crutch, as a way to crawl through its creative deficiencies, or its lack of polish, or both. Sure, Dragon Quest XI sticks closely to a tried and tested formula, but in this particular case, that's much easier to forgive, because even though it does that, it also constantly displays an immense mastery over and a thorough understanding of what makes for a truly great JRPG. Take, for instance, the story. Throughout the course of its long, winding journey, Dragon Quest XI hits a lot of the narrative beats that you'd expect it to, and a few that, to be fair, you wouldn't expect. And while you can certainly fault it for its unwillingness to tread new ground, you simply have to admire it for its excellent execution. Much of that is down to the game's excellent pacing. While most of the games of its ilk tend to get bogged down in heavy expository sequences or stretches and segments of story that simply go on for too long, Dragon Quest XI likes to keep things moving. You constantly find yourself in new situations, traveling to different exotic locations, and meeting new, whimsical characters. While there is a larger narrative that determines the direction of the entire experience at large, the game keeps moving through shorter, well-told, satisfying stories at a slick, rapid pace, all of which differ from each other quite a bit. The tale woven here evokes a very familiar feeling of a globe-trotting journey across a magical, fantastic land. A brand of storytelling that's by no means original, but is put to great use here nonetheless. Every town, city, or location you visit looks unique and immediately arresting. From desert cities and canal thoroughfares to colonial-style cities and lazy, isolated villages, each new area you visit feels distinct, not just in terms of visual design, but also the stories they tell and the collective personality they display as distinct regions of the world, from their own unique cultures to even their accents. Granted, much of this is caricaturized in keeping with the silliness and lighthearted nature of the rest of the game, but it all contributes greatly towards the game's strong identity. And even in spite of so much variation, the entire larger world of Dragon Quest XI still feels coherent, with a strong sense of place which it accomplishes through simple yet effective world building. What also helps is that the main cast of characters at the heart of the story is absolutely excellent. Each character is a well-defined personality, and each of them is brought to life by outstanding voice acting, for the most part, at least, and excellent writing that is translated surprisingly well thanks to strong localization. A few of the characters you will meet throughout the journey are absolutely brimming with an excess of personality, and they certainly leave a mark. This is a game that has a lot of moments with heart, and a lot of moments with warm humor, and while there are times when it does stumble a bit, it mostly manages to keep your attention for the entirety of its duration, which is an achievement in and of itself. While you shouldn't expect a riveting tale of intrigue and vast complexities, Dragon Quest XI accomplishes what it set out to do very well. The same can also be said of the game's combat. Dragon Quest XI features a conventional turn-based battle system that you'll be all too familiar with if you ever played a classic JRPG. You're given the ability to move around the camera and the characters freely during battle, but this is little more than stage dressing and doesn't have any mechanical impact on the battles at all. While the combat might seem a bit too dull or simplistic in the initial hours where you're limited to just controlling 1 or 2 party members, things quickly become more interesting as the game progresses. In typical JRPG fashion, you are restricted to having just 4 party members active at any time during combat, but you also have the ability to switch every one of your characters in and out of battles on the fly, and this constantly keeps things interesting and engaging. What also helps is that each of the characters in your party has their own advantages and disadvantages, and clearly defined strengths and weaknesses. Their specializations in different kinds of weapons, their individual stats, the amount of damage they can take or deal, the kinds of supporting spells and abilities they each have, how effective they are with magical abilities, and what kind of status moves they have are just a few of the factors that make them all equally viable options in battles, depending on the situation. This is further compounded by the fact that they each have their own unique skill trees as well, which gives you greater options of customization to grow each character in their own specific ways. Each party member also gains experience and levels up regardless of whether or not they're active in battle, so you never have to worry about anyone being left behind or be forced to grind to bring any of them up to a certain level. As a result, they all feel meaningfully different from one another, and none of them ever really end up feeling redundant or underutilized. The fact that the combat system encourages you to keep changing the composition of your party keeps things from getting monotonous. There are also pep moves. Every once in a while, characters in combat get pepped up, which is a heightened state of increased stats. As long as a character is pepped up, they can both deal and take more damage, or have better healing powers as the case may be, and they receive boosts to other stats. However, you can also choose to immediately use their pep to unleash a single, significantly more powerful move, many of which are presented through flashy, spectacular mini cutscenes, which can be skipped so you don't have to watch them repeatedly. There's variety in these moves, called pep powers, as well, as they can be anything from offensive moves to defensive ones, to ones that provide stat buffs to supporting attacks and so on. You can also combine 2 or more characters to unleash combo pep powers, and as your characters level and grow stronger, they're constantly learning new powers as well. You can of course also manually teach them new ones through their individual skill trees. Something else that bears mentioning is the enemy design. If you played even a single Dragon Quest game before, you'll probably be familiar with many of the monsters you'll face in battle here, but their rendition in Dragon Quest XI particularly makes them a treat to discover and behold, regardless. While their iconic and endearing designs obviously retain their core strengths, what make them truly stand out is their animations. From the way they move about while they're idle, to the way they attack, to how they react when they miss their attacks, to how they animate when they die, every monster in Dragon Quest XI has numerous delightful animations that lend a great deal of charm and personality to both the monsters themselves and the game in general. What is somewhat disappointing though is that while Dragon Quest XI's combat sets it up perfectly for an excellent level of strategy and variety, it often fails to capitalize on that potential due to its unchallenging nature. Switching up your party to meet particular challenges, for instance, would have been far more meaningful if the game leveraged that well enough by actually throwing tough encounters your way that forced you to truly think about the composition of your party. Hardly any boss battle in the game provides a challenge that's appropriate to the story, or the context of what's going on in the game at that moment, or even what some of the bosses look like. That's not to say that the game is an absolute breeze. Mindlessly repeating the same attacks on enemies might not work in several situations, especially in the game's final third, but a lot of the time, battles were over far more quickly than I expected, almost to the point of being anticlimactic. Unlike older Dragon Quest games, spots where you can save and rest up your party members are also littered throughout the world with far more frequency than what fans of the series might be used to, which also takes the edge off a little bit. There is, to be fair, an option for a harder difficulty setting in the form of Draconian mode. The one area where Dragon Quest XI does provide a familiar bit of challenge, at least more than its combat, is in the economy. Unlike a lot of other JRPGs, spending your hard-earned money to buy new equipment and weapons actually requires some thought. Especially during the game's first 25 to 30 hours. The amount of money you have at your disposal is limited, and buying the best possible gear for each and every one of your party members isn't always an option. You're never totally strapped for cash, but you do have to think about where you urgently need to invest, and where you can probably hold off on buying upgrades. However, purchasing things from shops isn't the only way to get better gear. Dragon Quest XI also lets you forge your own stuff via the forging minigame of sorts, which is surprisingly robust and enjoyable. The game allows you to pull out a portable forge at each and every one of its campsites in the overworld, which you can then use to craft or improve your weapons, armor, or equipment. This minigame requires you to hammer away at various segments of whatever it is you're crafting within certain given limitations. It's very easy to get into, and as the game progresses, it keeps adding small, yet efficient new layers on top of it. It doesn't ever become overly complex, and constantly remains pretty accessible, but also asks that you pay attention. It's a nice distraction, and over the course of my playthrough, it became a primary method of acquiring new gear, or improving what I already had. Crafting materials and resources are obviously needed to be able to create things using the mini forge, or the fun size forge as the game calls it, which also proves to be an excellent foil for the game's exploration aspects. Unlike most games you see in today's day and age, Dragon Quest XI doesn't have a vast, seamless open world that features almost a staggering amount of explorable areas, but there's plenty of reasons and opportunities to stray from the critical path, especially when the game provides additional methods of traversal further down the line. Coming across rare materials or even powerful gear as a result of exploration almost always feels rewarding. There are also collectibles in the game, which come in the form of mini-medals, Collecting these nets you with interesting rewards at regular intervals, which also provides the extra bit of motivation for exploring the nooks and crannies of the game's world, whether that's within cities and towns or out in the overworld. All that said though, the game doesn't ever get too overbearing with the vast open landscapes that are littered with excessive branching paths or optional areas, and this relative simplicity, as far as wandering off the beaten path goes, provides a nice balance. Exploration is always an option, but in keeping with its fast-moving nature and brisk pacing, Dragon Quest XI makes sure that it never gets in the way of its core experience. The fact that traversal can also be sped up considerably by holding down the right trigger, no matter what your method of transportation might be, also helps a great deal, as does the inclusion of an incredibly convenient fast travel system. Every once in a while, Dragon Quest XI also lets you ride on, or in, certain monsters that you come across, which first have to be defeated in combat. From mechanical beasts to giant hornets to creatures that can crawl up walls to a couple others that are best left unspoiled. Each of these provide their own unique styles of traversal and can oftentimes let you access branching areas that you wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. Just as it is with exploration in general, these are short sections that veer off from the critical path momentarily, but they almost always mete out meaningful rewards, and as such they usually feel worthwhile and rewarding. However, while Dragon Quest XI isn't as exploration heavy as many other games of its kind are, that doesn't mean it's lacking in terms of content. No, in fact, quite the opposite. It's overflowing with it. Just the main story in Dragon Quest XI can take roughly 70 hours to see through, while there's plenty of side activities to indulge in as well. There's also over 50 side quests on offer, but they mostly tend to be little more than fetch quests, and the rewards you get for completing them aren't really always worth the effort. Most notably though, once the credits have rolled, Dragon Quest XI still has plenty of content to offer. Fans of the series would expect the game to have meaningful post-game content that's properly story-driven, and with 15 to 20 hours of excellent in-game content, Dragon Quest XI certainly does not disappoint. Without getting into any spoilers, carrying on in your playthrough after the final credits have rolled is probably a good idea. While the combat and story in Dragon Quest XI can be described as unoriginal, but expertly executed, the one area where the game manages to truly stand out above all others is in the visuals. Simply put, this is one of the most strikingly beautiful games I've played in years. Dragon Quest XI employs the same cel-shaded aesthetic that the series has become synonymous with, which is powered by the excellent, immaculate art of the legendary Akira Toriyama. The visual splendor and sheer variety of the designs of the numerous locations you visit throughout the games are things I've already touched on, but it simply cannot be stressed enough. Around every corner is a beautiful vista to behold, or a breathtaking piece of scenery to absorb. From its sweeping views of vast landscapes to even the finer details, like the way the sun's rays bounce off beautiful bodies of glimmering water, Dragon Quest XI's visuals can take your breath away. There are a few instances when the game shows noticeable texture pop-ins, while instances of invisible walls can also break the game's otherwise incredibly strong immersion just a little bit. But in the larger scheme of things, both of these issues are relatively easy to ignore. As good as the game's visuals and presentation are though, they're often let down a little bit by its soundtrack. Dragon Quest has historically been known for having excellent music, and Dragon Quest XI reuses a lot of the tracks fans of the series have grown accustomed to over the years. That, in and of itself, isn't really much of an issue, even though the game does seem to cycle through only a handful of songs for the entirety of the experience. What hurts the music is the fact that the OST in Dragon Quest XI isn't orchestrated. As such, the music, which could otherwise have sounded appropriately catchy and grandiose, ends up sounding like a generic, synthesized imitation, and it often feels like it's at odds with the game's otherwise strong presentation. All said and done, Dragon Quest XI is a stellar game that displays a great command over the ins and outs of its genre in a way few other games can do. What it lacks in originality, it more than makes up for with its confident execution of ideas, showing that a game doesn't need to be revolutionary or the freshest thing on the block to be an incredible experience. With a memorable cast of characters, a well-told, briskly paced story, stunning and vibrant visuals, and a beautiful and extremely varied world as its setting, Dragon Quest XI serves as yet another excellent installment in this amazingly consistent franchise.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.